After the historic protests in Cuba earlier this month, President Biden is contemplating whether to allow remittances to Cuba as well as reestablish consular services in the country.
The Cuban citizens railed against the government amid food and medical supply shortages in the wake of the pandemic. Biden has stated support for the people of Cuba, while lawmakers call on the president to take further action. But what do voters actually think? Well, we have a new exclusive Hill-HarrisX data on the matter. Let's take a look.
In Cuba. The Cuban people demanding their freedom from an authoritarian regime. And I don't think we've seen anything like this protest in a long, long time, if quite frankly ever. The United States stands firmly with the people of Cuba as they assert their universal rights. And we call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence, their attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
The poll found 32% of voters said the U.S. should donate COVID vaccines to help Cubans. 24% said the U.S. should impose sanctions on Cuba's communist government. 22% said to loosen restrictions on remittances so Cuban Americans can send money to their families. 12% said the U.S. should lift the trade embargo, while 11% said to remove the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. However, a plurality of voters, 38%, said the U.S. should not get involved.
47% of Republican voters said the U.S. should not get involved, while 28% supported imposing sanctions on Cuba's communist government, and 23% said the U.S. should donate vaccines. Amongst Democrats, 44% said to donate vaccines. So, Robby, what's your take on this poll?
I mean, I also want to not be involved. We are already involved because the trade embargo is a massive involvement. We should get rid of that. We should have gotten rid of that decades ago. It never should have existed in the first place. So I mean, I want to do some of these things and not others. I think we should give coronavirus vaccines to everyone because it's really in our own security to have as much of the world vaccinated against the coronavirus as possible so that you don't have variants, that kind of thing. I definitely don't want an escalation of hostilities with Cuba. I support the Cuban people and think they should absolutely are right to march for freedom. The Cuban government is horrific, but we don't want another war on our hands. I don't know how many times we had to learn that lesson. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I thought Cuba had their own vaccines. So I'm a little confused about sending them some because I thought that their issue was they didn't have the supplies to administer. And the reason they couldn't get the supplies was because of the blockade on the country. So definitely, first and foremost, we have to stay out of it. Cuba is a different country. It's not our country. We don't need to get involved. Secondly, I do think that we need to lift the embargo. And I do think we need to lift all designations. Just leave at this point. I mean, look, how long have we been sanctioning Cuba, putting an embargo on them or a blockade on them? I mean, it has been decades now. If their government was going to collapse, it would have done so by now. Leave it alone. If you think communism is so bad, let it implode on its own. We don't need to help. If it is so bad, why do we need to help? Because we all know that sanctions, the whole entire point of that is to try to pressure a country to the point, get it to the brink of collapse or to actually collapse it to where the government, essentially, there's a regime change that ends up happening. That hasn't happened. So, at this point, it's just time to leave the country alone in every way, shape, and form.
And often doesn't happen. I'm really skeptical that sanctions are often likely to. I think they often do not achieve their stated ends. Right. The idea being to deprive the country of resources and make it a lot worse, so that they'll turn on their government. But if we are imposing sanctions or an embargo, then we are the source of their misfortune, not their government. And right. I think it can actually rally. It can play into a communist or an authoritarian government's their narrative that the U.S. or the West is evil, or it's all your problems are their fault. It becomes true in a sense if we are imposing punishing brutal sanctions or embargoes on the country. So it doesn't really work. I think it's more likely that if we allow trade, if we allow the country to flourish, then people they're more exposed to Western good ideas about democracy and market economies, and then they're more likely to want to make a change in government themselves. That obviously doesn't always work out. It hasn't worked out in China, but the alternative really doesn't look like it works to me, and then it also just promotes human misery, so we shouldn't do it.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right.
Yeah. On Monday, Florida Senator Rick Scott called for the Cuban embassy in D.C. to close. Let's roll that clip.
We have demands. They work for us. Number one, the Cuban embassy in D.C. needs to close today.
Scott also tweeted, the Cuban embassy shouldn't even be here. It's only here because of the failed Obama-Biden appeasement policies. I stand with everyone fighting for freedom and democracy for the Cuban people. I mean, look, if you're fighting for freedom and democracy for the Cuban people, then once again, lift the blockade.
Right.
That is the way forward. I mean, we have to stop putting our thumb on that country and controlling it. And I think, what you were saying earlier is that, well, if we lifted everything, then maybe they would flourish. And to your point, you say, well, maybe then people would, they would kind of see more of the world and they would want maybe a different system. And so that would be a choice that they make on their own, which would be, by the way, freedom and democracy. But one of the downside and what people are worried about, and the reason why so many people want to continue to keep them down, is because they are afraid the country will flourish. And then it's, oh no, the country did okay. So now what, under this dictatorship that we were claiming? And one thing that I really don't understand, and I'm Vietnamese, my family fled Vietnam, communist country, very, very similar situation. The Vietnamese people are extremely similar to the Cubans in that, the Vietnamese are here in California, by and large, vote Republican, against communism, but a very different attitude, the two different groups of people. The Cubans in Florida, what I don't understand is why they want to keep the people in Cuba down. Why do they want to keep the embargoes, the blockades on them, the sanctions, whereas the Vietnamese people just didn't have that same sentiment regarding Vietnam. So there was never any of this political motivation by these politicians to continue, because what do these politicians care, right? They don't care about Cuba. They're just doing it for the political brownie points. So if the population stops, and this is where I really put the blame. I put the blame on the Cuban Floridians. I think they're the problem. If they would just drop it, the politicians would as well.
Well, I think threatening to close the embassy is about the most empty, just kind of shake your fist in frustration threats. I don't see what it accomplishes. We should be talking with people, even with regimes we don't like, because that's better than the alternative, which is war. So it's just, it's typical kind of military rah-rah-rah posturing that you get from some Republicans that is just utterly unhelpful. Thanks for watching What America's Thinking. We'll see you next time.